This man right here is Mr. George Soros, the 92-year-old Hungarian-born financier billionaire who set up the Open Society Foundation, endowed it with billions of dollars, which eventually flowed into different left-wing causes across the entire world. However, despite the fact that George Soros' money is behind many of the groups that we see in the news today, the fact that he bankrolled many of the district attorneys across the entire country, and despite the fact that he's consistently, time and again, the biggest campaign donor election cycle after election cycle, well, nobody knows much about him. His work is shrouded in a veil of mystery, and if you dare to talk about him publicly, well, you're apt to get labeled as being a conspiracy theorist. He is, you can rightfully say, the man behind the curtain. And so, in order to take a peek behind that curtain, I took the opportunity to sit down and interview Mr. Matt Palumbo, an investigative journalist, as well as the author of the book, The Man Behind the Curtain, Inside the Secret Network of George Soros. And because of his investigative work, he was able to offer a rare glimpse into the network set up by Mr. Soros. And so strap yourselves in, smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, and take a listen. All right, so we are here with Mr. Matt Palumbo, who is the author of this book right here, The Man Behind the Curtain, peeling back sort of the layers behind a shadowy figure, Mr. George Soros, who has become something of a, you can say, third rail in the national discussion. It's the taboo subject that you're not allowed to discuss. He funds everything, but as soon as you mention the name George Soros, well, you're cut off. Mr. Matt Palumbo, thank you so much for joining us. Yep. So let's begin at the very beginning. Let's set the stage for the audience, because I think a lot of them understand George Soros exists. He's out there somewhere. He's the shadowy figure, but you're not allowed to talk about him. So can you set the stage for us? Where did he come from, and how did he become the man that he is today?
George Soros was born closer to the beginning of the 20th century. Obviously, he's in his 90s now, ideally near the end of his life, given the record of his life. But he was born in Hungary, ended up fleeing Hungary to escape Nazis during the Holocaust. You know, there's sort of this internet myth that Soros was a Nazi. However, having said it's a myth, a very toned down version of it actually is true, and that when he was under protection in Hungary by a man his father put him under. He's only known as the Godfather. Soros and this Godfather were assigned this task by the Nazis to sort of out Jews from the local populations. This was an earlier time, pre-Holocaust, where Nazis were recruiting Jews from the local population. Many of these Jews were under this sort of false impression that maybe if they helped out in serving these deportation notices or confiscating the other goods of Jews, they would be exempt. And obviously that ended up not being true, but Soros ended up helping with this, and there's a very revealing interview in 60 Minutes where the host Steve Croft brought this up and then handed Soros on a platter the out. Well, surely this isn't something you wanted to do, surely you just went along with this, and Soros is very calm, matter-of-fact, oh no, it's something I enjoyed participating in, and if I didn't do it, someone else would have done it. Now this so-called Godfather Soros was with arguably saved his life. We at never at point during his entire life Soros ever identified this Godfather. He ended up dying a number of years ago. It wasn't until 2019 that this guy was even identified. And again, Soros never thanked the man who saved his life at all. So that's the kind of guy he is, and this is just from his teenage years. You sort of have an idea of the kind of person he is. Sorry, when it's time to go to college, he decides he wants to go to London. He goes to the London School of Economics. This is where he meets a man named Karl Popper, who created this concept called the Open Society, of which Soros' foundation is named after. Now, one of the weird things about researching this is there's this sort of Open Society Foundation on paper, and then what Soros interprets it as. And you see this with all kinds of liberal ideas. It's very rarely the case that they're stated goals and actual, the consequences are the same. So the Open Society is supposed to be, a society that emphasizes the individual, is very just open-minded, doesn't adhere to dogma. The only sort of left-wing-ish thing they throw in there in the official definition is that they promote social justice. But on paper, it's supposed to be this very libertarian-ish thing, and one would think actually sort of like what America embodies. Karl Popper himself said that he views America as the embodiment of an open society. Soros, on the other hand, says that America is the antithesis of it. So he studied another guy who coined the term. Clearly his interpretation of what an open society is quite the opposite. He is much more globalist, is much more self-serving, and ultimately narcissistic, I would argue.
Well, let me actually ask you about that, because the book that influenced him the most, according to your research, is this Karl Popper work, Open Societies and Its Enemies. If someone's not familiar with that society, from my understanding of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, it promotes individualism, correct, democracy, things like that. So from your research, how does George Soros kind of balance this relationship between this believing in a society to the point that he actually named his foundation after it, of democracy, individualism, but at the same time he works against, in a certain sense, democracy and individualism by trying to erase nation states, by trying to quash populist movements, et cetera. How does he balance those two?
Well, I would say it's sort of the left. We see this very often, where it's claiming to be doing things on behalf of the values of the society is almost just a mask. I mean, we see this with every liberal group. It's racial justice this. They just throw the word justice onto the most random things ever. Reproductive justice than with abortion. And it's just, with really every left-wing movement, there is what they say things are and what they really are. I mean, a very common theme for the past 20 years in particular has been words losing all meaning. We saw during the Trump era, if you, let's say, even by accident called someone by the wrong pronoun, that would be violence. If an Antifa punches an old lady in the face, that somehow is not violence. I mean, you see this in legislation, where pretty much any title of a bill is an advertisement for the bill. So they were doing this with gas prices recently, where they had a bill called the anti-price gouging bill. And well, if you vote against that, you're voting for price gouging. Well, in reality, if you vote for the bill, you're voting for gas shortages. But the name serves a purpose, and that when you report on the bill, the headline is just Republicans vote down anti-price gouging bill, and low IQ people who don't really read past the headline or don't understand basic economics are only going to see that message. And I think Soros takes advantage of that a lot. One of the things, and we'll go into the different spheres of influence, but one of the things he does in these poor countries is almost a sort of ideological colonialism, where he'll put NGOs in these countries, and they'll be building schools and hospitals, all these things people like. But there's always this overarching progressive tint. If they're going to say, hey, we have an area where there's no one knows anything about sex education, they'll say, we'll fill that need. But you're also getting this weird, sort of creepy, wacky, liberal, trans-inclusive version of that that did not exist even 20 years ago. So that's primarily how he operates. And I don't really think he does believe in this open society. I think it's either he's misinterpreting it wrong, or it's just a shield so he can say that's what I believe. It would be like, me saying, I'm Matt Palumbo, I stand for liberty and justice, and then anytime I do something antithetical, I go, no, I'm the justice guy. It's sort of the same thing.
Well, in that case, let me ask you then, if you think he uses this open society philosophy as sort of a shield, because some people who are cynical, they say, well, it's to amass more wealth and more power. But at the same time, I wonder, because even in your book you said that by the time he reached the $25 million mark, when he had $25 million, he said, well, I have enough money, I want to use the rest of my life in philanthropy. Now, since then, of course, he's
got the $40 million from the, so clearly he's not really good at setting those parameters, yeah.
What would you say his goal is, though?
Well, that is the tough thing, because I mean, money itself, there's diminishing returns to how much money he can have. I mean, he's not going to spend it in one lifetime, and he seems to be using most of the money towards philanthropy. He donated close to $20 billion recently. So clearly it can't be just the money, because it's going towards these efforts. So, at risk of giving an oversimplified explanation, I think it is power for the sake of power. And, I'm very cautious, especially when you're talking about like the average Republican or Democrat, to not be like, they're motivated by malice or evil. Usually people really do what they're thinking is good and have a misguided way of getting there. That is not true with people like George Soros, I would argue. One of the reasons I say that is because there is, I'm always asking, what's the theory when you want to do something? And I can't find it for a lot of what he's doing. The defunding the police and the local prosecutors. What is the theory? Like, okay, so you think cops are racist. You want to defund police. Tell me the process. So we have racist cops making 50 grand a year. Now they're making 40 grand a year. What changed? Okay, we have racist cops that earn marginally less money. So there's no theory behind why that would help at all. And especially with the local prosecutors, where it's okay, let's decriminalize crime. Who's helped by that? I mean, there's just no explanation. I mean, if it was one thing where it's like, hey, you can go to jail for 10 years for shoplifting, I'd go, okay, it's a bit ridiculous, but it's just basic quality of life laws that Soros is against. And as we sort of actually saw in this city back in the 80s or 70s through 90s, really, once you stop enforcing things like laws against graffiti, public homelessness, public drinking, public drug use, public gambling, you invite a certain type of person to that area, And you also just sort of, normal everyday people tend to avoid certain areas, and it's just a recipe for crime and lawlessness and further destruction, and it causes people to not respect the law. And a large part of what Rudy Giuliani did when cleaning up the city was all these things that seem unrelated, like there's a murder crisis, but we're getting rid of the squeegee men and graffiti and open prostitution. But what happens then is normal people come out in the middle of the day and at night, and then there's really not as much opportunity to commit crimes. So that's why I just can't. There's no. He can't even give a pretend motive that makes sense to me. So that's why I would say in his case, I actually do think it's actual malice.
Interesting. Yeah. And then before we move on from discussing his philosophy, the last question I had is in regards to this open society that he's trying, at least statedly trying to build. What does that look like? Based on at least the writings and based on maybe the stated mission goal of his foundation, when can he say that, yes, I've achieved the open society? What does that end goal look like?
Well, that's the thing about left-wing activism, is it's deliberately open-ended. It is set up in a way where it can never end and will always perpetuate. So Black Lives Matter, for instance, will go, as long as there's one unarmed black person or armed black person being killed by police, we have a movement. Well, there's 50 million black people in the country, there's 700,000 cops. There are billions of interactions every day. By random chance, there is going to be at least one incident per year for the end of time, and the movement will be able to exist. The gay rights movement is another example. They were big on marriage, equal treatment. Very successful campaign. We pretty much have both of those things. In marriage, obviously, of course, most people are relatively tolerant of gays. And then the narrative just shifts. It's shifted. We gotta see this with the transgender movement, where it's trans rights, and what rights do transgender people not have? No one can give me one answer, but this is just a new thing we have to perpetuate. Or movements will shift. I mean, we sort of see this with, actually another example of the gay rights movement, where back in the 1980s, it was considered homophobic to say that AIDS is a gay disease, because you're unjustly maligning a population because a majority of cases in the population. Now, in the year 2022, it's homophobic to not say it's a gay disease because it disproportionately affects them, and if it's killing them disproportionately, well, you wouldn't want to take that away from that group. So even their standards will shift to accommodate a cultural shift, and so that the movement will never end. And it's just very common. You could even say it with environmental activists, where once we get, carbon emissions below what they want it to be, it's always going to be a little bit more. We have a life with trade-offs. There's always going to be pollution. There's going to be murder, other sorts of crimes. And they can always argue for doing one more thing to bring it down. But as you do that, there's just more and more diminishing returns. It gets more and more costly to fight a problem the more you reduce it. There is actually no end goal. And if they meet it, the goalpost is going to move. That will be hit. It'll move again. Prior achievements will be reframed in a way. I think civil rights is the big example, where our civil rights activists today speak about the modern day as if it's a Wednesday in Mississippi in 1863. There's no linear time is constantly blurred, there's just no end to it ever.
Let's talk about the method then. The Open Society Foundation is something that everybody knows exists. Everybody knows a lot of money gets doled out of it. But again, it's like the same thing as George Soros. It's the third rail. And I remember in October of 2017, Trump was about a year into his presidency, and I came to the office, and on the table was that day's Wall Street Journal, and it said, front page above the fold, George Soros donates $18 billion to Open Society. And I remember reading that, and I looked around the office. I'm like, this is huge. This is
It was the biggest charitable, in quotes, contribution of all time, from what I read. Yeah.
But then afterwards, no news, nothing. It's like it disappeared into the void. Yeah. Let's talk about the Open Society Foundation. What are the origins of it? What is it, and how does it actually operate?
Well, the origins was, as we stated, George Soros, once he made a certain amount of money, decided, I'm going to never make any more money, and then made a ton more money. But as part, founded the Open Society Foundation, and it's almost like a conglomerate of a charity, where it has global operations. They've got chapters in various countries that are basically NGOs. And then here it finances the Soros media empire, and then also spends a lot of money on candidates. So that's pretty much it. And to touch on the charitable donation, one of the big parts of it that's sort of been swept under the rug, which I find surprising in the current culture where everyone's aware of billionaires not paying taxes, is it gave him sort of this double tax dodge, where he has money in one pocket, and when you're a billionaire, you've got a lot of stocks and bonds. Those increase in value over time, but you don't pay tax until you sell them. So he dodged all the taxes on them by donating them to his own foundation. because the capital gain doesn't get realized. It gets transferred over to the private charity. And then for 5 years, he gets to write off that $19 billion against his taxes. So he pays no tax for 5 years. But it's not like a normal write-off where you're spending money and then sort of getting reimbursed by the government. He's literally moving money from one pocket to the other and getting a tax write-off on both ends. So I think that's itself a very big story, and I don't really think anyone really covered that much.
So then the Open Society Foundation. So what is the structure actually like? So is George Soros still sort of overseeing the entire thing?
Officially, but it looks like his son Alexander Soros is really the one running the show right now. Yeah, I mean, he's 91, 92 years old, so it's just, I imagine at that age you're limited physically.
And so then Alexander Soros, his son, is sort of at the top overseeing the Open Society chapters in all these different countries. And then let's say the one in America. Is there a different chapter in each state?
Not that I'm aware. I believe it's just the New York based, and then it's from there. It's sort of like an octopus where the money is just going to thousands of different causes he wants. And actually, one of the parts of the book people really liked a lot was at the end. I just have 20 or 30 pages where I just have a table of every notable group he's ever donated to, and it's a sort of description of them, just so people, when they see a group and want to know who's behind it, can just kind of go through the index and see if it's there.
Can you give us some interesting examples?
I mean, Acorn was a big one. I remember James O'Keefe, kind of his rise to fame. The Tides Foundation, as I stated. A lot of not Black Lives Matter directly, but Black Lives Matter adjacent groups where it's sort of like just a clone of BLM. I don't know why he chose those groups over others. A lot of groups behind the Ferguson protests he funded. There was a $1 million campaign he funded to try to stop Glenn Beck, get him off Fox, that he funded through Media Matters. Just all these random little things where his name's popping up.
You said thousands, right? Thousands of these.
Yeah, I mean, in the list, I only I think maybe it's in the hundreds. I mean, if I had literally every group he's ever given at least $1 to, it would be longer than the entire book. So I just focus on the big ones. But yeah, I've got a couple hundred in there.
How do you think from your research, how does this process work? Let's say I am. I'm an on-the-ground Antifa soldier, and someday I say, you know what? I'm tired of smashing these windows. I want to start my own organization to, advance social justice. How do I get that Soros money? Do I apply for it? How does that work?
Yeah, so there is. I mean, most of it's just like already established things. But yeah, you can go on the website. You can apply for a grant, and I guess if you need some windows broken, he'll maybe help fund that. Yeah, he seems to fund a lot of just sort of people on the top. Like, it's if you were to say Soros funds Antifa, it's not directly like, hey, you're an Antifa guy, here's money. It's certain activist groups. I know I have the names in there. I can't recall one off the top of my head, but we're funding the activist groups, and that's why they all have these matching signs and $300 batons are waving around. But he's not funding them directly. It's the people above them that are sort of the sort of overseers. I get it. Which strategically that would sort of make the most sense. You have a very controlled and a hierarchy above these crazies you're funding.
Yeah, and then I imagine that either George or Alexander, they can't possibly be reviewing every single application. So do you know what the inside of the organization actually looks like? Do they just have a driving ethos that this is our worldview, this is what we want to advance, and if your application kind of jives with that, we'll fund you?
Yeah, I would assume it's more like that. I mean, one of the reasons I don't know the exact process is there was actually a study, and I think it was 2016 or 17, by a group called Transparify. It was just looking at transparency in various charitable organizations, and the Open Society Foundation was ranked the #1 least transparent organization. I mean, obviously there's reporting requirements you have to obey, but yes, they're very secretive. Mailed them a copy of my book, have not heard back, so maybe they're not a fan. But
interesting. The Open Society is very closed.
It's very close, which goes to my thing. They don't actually believe it.
That's fascinating. Yeah. In your book, you gave one example about the Ferguson protest. Can you set that stage and tell the audience that story?
Yeah, so he funded a lot of groups that just pushed the lie that Michael Brown had his hands up and said don't lie, don't shoot. Funded a lot of these groups that took to the streets and in effect burnt down Ferguson. And they all have nice sounding names like Movement for Black Lives and Justice this, Justice that. But as we see in reality, that's what they're doing. And yeah, I mean, a lot of what Soros does, and to sort of go on a bit of a tangent, in the intro where I talk about his philosophy, there's this concept in finance called reflexivity that he created. And it's a very brilliant concept in that He notes that in financial markets, expectations will often create realities, and you see this all throughout history, whether it be tulip bulbs or the housing market in 07 and 08, or GameStop stock in last year for whatever reason. That if people think something's going to happen, it actually will happen. Obviously, the opposite might happen way after as the market corrects, but expectations set reality. And Soros realized, well, that's true of media as well. If you tell people what to expect, they're going to reinterpret reality in that effect. So whether it be the hands up, don't shoot, where when you're first to the story, the correction usually doesn't get heard. So they spread that lie. The reality is that never happened, but it doesn't matter. We saw this during the George Floyd protests, where we were all told if we leave our houses, we're killing grandma because of COVID. And then we're all watching what I think it might have been as much as 30 million people took to the streets, and we're going, well, this can't be good for COVID. And then as that's happening, all these articles are coming out going, all right, so listen, there might be a spike in COVID cases in 2 weeks, but here's the real reason. Knowing that these dumb liberals obviously don't want to believe they're responsible, but so they'll go, oh, this complete nonsensical reason, that's the real reason that coincides with all us screaming outside. So yeah, so that's a big thing, is just setting the narrative. I mean, the biggest one, and I think you'll probably ask about this because I get asked this in every question, is how the heck is it that we can't criticize George Soros? Comedians are always saying, you're supposed to, or liberals are always saying like about comedians, oh, you got to punch up, you can't punch down. Well, this is punching up. He's got, over his lifetime, made $40 billion and has an enormous amount of influence and had 500 A-list celebrities at his wedding. So I would think he's fair game. And what he's taken advantage of is just this sort of narrative where any disagreement of the left is categorized as racism. And he's lucky because he gets his own category of racism. He can say it's anti-Semitic, which is often viewed as even worse than just general racism, given the recentness of the Holocaust, which he played no role in preventing. So it's his main thing. And in the media chapter of the book, I have a list of publications that are linked to Soros. The way I link it, and I didn't want it to be like he knows a guy who knows a guy. I made it where if you are on a group that gets a significant amount of Soros money, but ideally literally a Soros group, and you're on the board, and then you're also work for a media organization, I say you're Soros linked, and just go on any of the publications that are Soros linked, ABC, CBS, CNN, Washington Post, New York Times. I mean, the list is a very long list. Type in Soros's name and just look at how they cover him. And it's always, if it's ever anything negative, it's anti-Semites say negative claim, or it's a very common theme of the media. I think the Washington Post and the Hill sort of pioneered this, where if a Republican does something wrong, the story is the Republican doing something wrong. If a Democrat screws up and does something wrong, the story is Republicans pounce on Democrats doing whatever. It's always framed as the right-wing outrage over them doing something wrong, to try to make it seem like, oh, well, it can't be that big a deal, but just get a load of these people who are upset about it. So that's just another reframing technique that's been very big. And in this case, it's been to say criticizing Soros is somewhat anti-Semitic, even though he's not a practicing Jew. And I would be surprised if more than 50% even knew he was Jewish. I don't think that's the first thing anyone looks up on a person, but what do I know?